One thing that we're very bad at in our culture is understanding what is meant by spontaneity. We do understand spontaneity in a kind of a way. We kind of basically know what it means, that stuff is spontaneous when we don't think about it. It's not premeditated or pre-deliberated. So although we understand spontaneity in that sense, we do at the same time trivialize it and think of it as being a relatively minor part of life. So it's nice to have spontaneity in certain parts of our lives. It's nice to have spontaneity, to be spontaneous, but we don't really see it as that being that important, not crucially important. And spontaneity isn't a nice, pretty, frilly little thing that we can have a bit of. It's actually a strong principle, not a weak principle. Spontaneity is a very, very strong thing. It's an implacable thing. And what I mean by this is it's something we can't go against, and it's something we can't manipulate at all, despite our great predilection for manipulating, because we think we can manipulate everything, and we think we can manipulate compassion, for example, so that we can use compassion to help us heal or to help us in a therapeutic way. And even though this sounds very nearly right and it sounds okay, there is a hidden problem, a hidden glitch, and it's very, very easy for us to miss this hidden glitch, because what we're forgetting is that although everything else is fine and compassion is great and compassion is really helpful, there's no way that we can use it, because if we're using it, what that really means is thought is using it. And what that means is that thought is the boss. Thought always likes to be the boss because it can't trust anything else and doesn't believe in anything else at the end of the day. So when we have a slightly disparaging or condescending would be a better word attitude to all things spontaneous, that's because thought doesn't really trust that at all. It can't argue away spontaneity, but it does speak of it in a kind of condescending way. Thought cannot recognize any master other than itself, or other than a master which it itself has invented and then claims to be different from it, even though it is just its own invention. So thought does that a lot. It invents a higher power that is actually just itself in disguise. Thought is limited. It doesn't have the ability to appreciate that there are principles which go beyond it and are more primary than it is, because thought isn't primary. It's a part of everything, but it doesn't come first. It comes second. It comes after the main thing, and the main thing is always spontaneity. That's just another way of talking about freedom. There's no constraint. There are no constraints. Everything does what it does, and that's spontaneity. And we can talk about compassion-based therapy as a way of just making this a little bit clearer. So in compassion-based therapy, we are asked to be compassionate to ourselves instead of being judgmental and critical and damning and all of that. And as I've said before, that's fine if we have that compassionate nature in us that can be manifested very easily. But if we don't, then we can't invent compassion, and we can't consciously, deliberately manifest it. And so that puts us in a tricky position. So if I happen to be a person who can manifest my compassionate nature easily, that's fine. Compassion is then a way of looking at things. That's a way of relating to myself that I now have. Now, if I don't have that developed compassionate nature, which isn't to say that I don't have a compassionate nature, but that it isn't developed, then what am I going to do then? So in the first case, I don't really need compassion-based therapy interventions because I'm already compassionate to myself. In the second case, I need it, but telling me about it doesn't help because it isn't there in me. So what do I do in that case? And even though it might seem that I'm splitting hairs, if it actually happens to be you or me who's sitting there trying very, very hard to be compassionate to myself, or whoever it is being compassionate to themselves, but it just doesn't happen, then we're left in this position of being even less compassionate to ourselves than we usually are, because we're blaming ourselves for not being compassionate. We're disappointed in ourselves for not being compassionate, or we're thinking that there's something wrong with us because we're not able to be compassionate, and that's an even bigger gap. If I think so there's something wrong with me, I'm alienated from myself straight away. It's like saying, well, this thing isn't working, I don't want anything to do with it, this thing's broken, which is of course a very, very common attitude to take to oneself if there is some kind of mental health disorder going on, because our only way of understanding it is to say this brain of mine, or this mind of mine, is broken, and to see it in a pathological way rather than seeing it in a different way. And so we need to really think about things in a different way, instead of thinking, okay, I need compassion. Supposing that I haven't got the compassion, what do I do then? And in one way, the answer to that question is very easy, because then, well, if I don't have compassion, I continue as I am in the non-compassionate way. And that's obviously what I do, because there's nothing else for me to do. There's no other options open to me. And this doesn't sound like a good option, because nothing's changing. But it is a good and helpful option all the same. It's a good and healthy option because there's acceptance in it. So if I can carry on the way that I am, and even though I'm seeing myself clearly for being non-compassionate to myself, or maybe to others too, then in that is a degree of acceptance. If I can actually see this is how I am, and acknowledge this is how I am, this is the way that I am, this is me, that is acceptance. So we've wandered now from compassion-based therapy to acceptance-based therapy. But even this isn't an answer, because the obvious thing that happens then, for most of us, in most cases, almost all cases, is that we can't accept, I can't accept. So it's the same thing again with acceptance instead of compassion. Acceptance is a spontaneous thing. It happens if it happens. And there's no way for us to manipulate it to happen. Which isn't immediately clear to us as a culture, because, as I keep on saying, we kind of believe, we have this faith or confidence that we can manipulate anything if we're good enough, if we're given a chance. But it's very easy to show exactly why we can't manipulate self-acceptance or any form of acceptance. And the reason we can't manipulate acceptance to get it to serve us is simply because, very, very simple, it's because if I'm trying to manipulate or control, then that is because I don't like things being the way that they are. So, in other words, manipulation and control is always founded upon non-acceptance. Non-acceptance is the stone, the bedrock, which control and manipulation comes out of. So straight away, the whole thing becomes ridiculous, because the only reason we're interested in acceptance is because we don't like the state of non-acceptance, which is our everyday state, because how we are is, in our essence, or maybe not in our essence, but in our everyday nature, is manipulating and controlling. That's what the everyday self does. It has tricks for everything. Every situation has a trick that it can wheel out. If these tricks work, then we get to feel good about ourselves, have high self-esteem. If our tricks, if we wheel them out and they don't work, and they fall flat, then we feel bad about ourselves and we have low self-esteem. But all that is based on how good we are at controlling. And normally in life, we're so good at controlling, we don't even notice we're controlling. And so the sense of well-being that we have is a very particular type of well-being. It's the well-being that's based on us not being aware of our controlling, because circumstances are such that we can habitually manage ourselves, manage the way we perceive reality, manage our perceptions of ourselves, how we are with ourselves, whether we like ourselves or don't like ourselves. We can do that easily without even knowing we're doing it. That's the normal state of existence that we have. And that's the state that is normally, or sometimes, called the unconscious state. We can afford to be unconscious because everything's going smoothly, and the habit takes over. And when the habit can, or the reflex mind, or the habit-based mind can take over and run everything properly, we're happy as Larry, and we call that life, really. That's what we see as being life. Then something turns up that doesn't fit the habit, or doesn't fit the reflex. So even though the habit will then kick off and the reflex will kick off, it won't solve the situation, it'll make it worse. And then we start to become painfully aware of this reflex kicking off, and also being painfully aware of, usually when we do this, it has a good result and we get some kind of validation or comfort from it. And now we're not. So that is a very shocking experience, because here is this whole apparatus that we've got so very used to using, and it always works. And because of that, we take it totally for granted. And then when it stops working, then not only is there the discomfort or pain that we are unable to control to go away, which is a big deal in itself, but there is also the disillusionment, which is very, very hard to believe, but the but which hits us in the face anyway, the disillusionment with the fact that we're not able to control. And so this situation is the situation of neurosis. And we always see neurosis as being a situation in which our ability to control is jeopardized or jinxed. But we see this as a bad thing, a pathology, because we see the healthy and helpful thing to do is to control. So although we kind of see neurosis correctly in a way, we wrongly identify it as being a pathology. Whereas in actual fact, the pathology is the fact that I've spent my whole life habituating myself to this automatic pattern of existence, this automatic pattern of avoiding or massaging away or spin doctoring or editing my experience so I don't have to know about the painful bits, the challenging bits and the traumatic bits. So really that part of me has got jinxed. The part of me that helps me not to see what's actually going on, but that even though the result of it suddenly stopping working is an incredible amount of suffering that I wouldn't have known existed before it happened, it is still not a pathology. Because if we understand it this way, then we can't call it a pathology, no matter how much it might devastate our lives and make us incapable of carrying out our normal routines or functioning in the way that we normally do. We still can't see that as a pathology because our way of life was based on an unhealthy way of doing things to start off with. So when that unhealthy way of doing things starts to crack up and starts failing, that is actually the beginning of health rather than a regrettable interruption to health. But the problem that comes to us when we are actually experiencing all this pain, apart from the pain itself, which pain is not a problem, really. We can't call it a problem as such. It's a fact of our existence. Now, that doesn't mean that we have to kind of believe that we have to be suffering the whole time. But at any one point in time, if we are suffering, that suffering is not a problem. It's a fact of our existence. A problem, if it were a problem, that would imply that there's a thing to do to fix it. And that's the delusional belief which we always have. If it's something that we can't fix, and that sounds like a terrible thing, a thing that we can't fix, it's like an admission of defeat, but it isn't, because the thing that we can't fix, another term for that is just to call it reality. And so that doesn't mean that this is a bad situation. Of course, we can't fix reality. I impose our ideas of how it should be on it. So even when reality is very, very tough, we can't fix it. And that's because it isn't a problem. So saying that we can't change our state of mind, that we can't fix it, is not an admission of failure. It would be wrong-headed of us to imagine that we should try and fix it. So this comes back to the question of acceptance. If I see something as a problem, then that means I can't accept it. It's broken. I'm broken. My brain isn't working properly, or things aren't working properly. And that's non-acceptance. That way of looking at things is non-acceptance. But non-acceptance is the basis for how the machine works. It's the basis for how the reflex mind works. As I was saying earlier, that's the bedrock, is non-acceptance. And that shouldn't really come as any surprise, that our bedrock for our normal form of functioning is non-acceptance, because the basis of our normal form of functioning is the thinking mind, and the thinking mind is essentially a set of assumptions that guide how we perceive reality and think reality should be. And so, because the thinking mind is based on an idea, a kind of a picture of how things should be, that means that it is automatically resistance, because there is no way that reality can ever correspond to a fixed way of looking at things or a fixed way of formulating things. In other words, reality is never going to match up with thoughts, ideas for it, or thoughts, assumptions of it. There's always going to be a mismatch. Now, from time to time, it might seem that there isn't a mismatch and things seem to be perfect. When we say perfect, we mean it exactly matches our thoughts about how it should be. There's nothing really perfect about that, and it can happen that things do temporarily match up how we think they should be. But that's more of an accident than anything else. And just as that can happen for a while, it won't last for very long. And it's not a very good it's not a very good thing for us to base our well-being on, because we're basing our well-being on something very, very unreliable. So thought itself is non-acceptance. It's a rigid thing. Thought projects its ideas, its framework on the world, and then controls so as to get the world to conform to how it thinks it should be. Thought is never, it's not about acceptance, it never was about acceptance. Acceptance is a different type of thing. Thought is aggressive, which is another way of putting it. Thought is pure aggression. And in a psychological sense, aggression just means that I have a notion how things should be, and I project that notion on how things actually are. There's your aggression straight away. And this translates into a total insensitivity to how things are, or total uncaringness, really. When we're in this mode, we absolutely have no interest at all in how things are in themselves, only in how we can make them. And that is the normal everyday modality that we're in. A non-accepting modality, an aggressive modality. So then once we've gone through spelling all this out, then we can ask the question again, well, how does acceptance work? How can I accept when the very basis of how I'm put together is based on non-acceptance? And what emerges from this is the fact that I can actually see that myself as I know myself and as I usually am is based on non-acceptance, and it can never ever accept anything. And I can understand that perfectly well, because all machines are based on non-acceptance. My normal modality of functioning is that of a machine. Therefore, I cannot accept. And I can see that very, very clearly. I've understood the machine. I've understood the extrinsic self, the mechanical self or conditioned self. I've understood it. I'm not asking it to do anything impossible. I see that it can never, ever accept. And that in itself is acceptance. Thanks for watching.